how does a railroad get to Newburgh? Well, at Dutchess Junction, they had built a ferry service to haul train cars across the river. So the other end of the railroad was actually a barge ride to Newburgh. They had barges with railroad tracks on the deck, and they would just roll the cars out onto the barge, anchor them down, run them across the river with a steamboat called the Fanny Garner. This was in 1872, 73, 74, along in that time frame when it started. And by 1878, 79, along in that time frame, that was a going business, hauling tons and tons of Pennsylvania coal, mainly coal, across the river. And then we're distributing it all through New England, and Dutchess County, of course. But the problem was the length of time it took to get a train across the river. You had to roll the cars on. You couldn't roll the whole train onto the barge. You rolled a few cars on, open it up, run a few more cars on the track next to it. And it was a rather labor-intensive, slow operation to get a train across the river. It took a couple hours to get a train across the river. And in addition to that, the problem was in the winter when the river froze up, you couldn't get them across at all. Just when you needed the coal in the wintertime, you couldn't get it across the river. So people started looking at this and saying, well, we need a bridge. So it was during that time frame that they started planning and building the big bridge in Poughkeepsie. The William T. Hart was actually named for one of the original, I guess he was the president of the New York and New England Railroad. But anyway, at the time it went into service across the river, it was the second largest ferry boat in the world. It was over 300 feet long, and it had two completely independent steam engines, one on the right side, one on the left, so that they could reverse one of them and turn it around in its own length. So it was it was the latest and greatest in 1881 when it went into service. And they could take 27 cars at a time across the river. So, it was still pretty slow because you had to load all the cars on. And this was in 1881. Now we're still getting closer and closer to the building of the big bridge in Poughkeepsie. Now, the ND&C Railroad was still running, hauling coal, and the New York and New England was also hauling coal. And at that point, it's in the 1880s, coal was the big thing. Everybody ran on coal. Nobody had an oil burner because they hadn't dug oil out of Pennsylvania yet at that point, at least not enough of it to do any good. So and also some of the coal came across from Pennsylvania through the canal to Rondout in Kingston in barges through the canal. And from there, it came down the river to Dutchess Junction, and they would load it onto train cars and distribute it. But it still depended on the river. And when it iced over, you got a problem. So I guess when they finally did build the big railroad bridge, it opened. The first train across it was in December of 1888. But the problem was there weren't any tracks on the west end of the bridge. Tracks didn't go anywhere. So the train ran over to Highland and came back again. That was as far as it could go. And it took a good 6 months after the bridge was built before they had tracks that ran from Highland on down to what they call Orange Junction, which later became Maybrook. During the life of the bridge, when it was first built, it had two sets of stringers across. In other words, it was a dual kind of a bridge, and it had two tracks on the top. Well, when these heavier 210-2 locomotives came along in 1918, the locomotives were so much heavier and the freights were getting bigger and heavier that they discovered that the bridge was beginning to tilt when it went across. They said, this is not a good idea. So they strengthened the bridge during the time frame from about 1907 to 1910. They put a third set of steel all through the center of the bridge. If you look at old pictures of the bridge, you can see the early pictures, there were 2 sets of steel, and later pictures, there were 3 sets of steel into the bridge. And the tracks on the top were converted to what they call, they were moved to the point where they were in the center rather than on 2 tracks on the sides. Okay, they were called a gauntlet. And they moved the tracks into the center, and but then the problem then was only 1 train at a time could use the bridge. Well, that wasn't too big a problem because they put signal towers on the ends and controlled the traffic. But with the weight in the center of the bridge, then it wouldn't tilt side to side anymore. And it remained that way until 1960 or 61, I think, when they single tracked it all the way through.